as to whether the state thinks that each of the 34,265 temples merit the takeover by the state. The funny part is, at least 60 to 70% of these temples make an annual income of less than or equal to 10,000 rupees. So where is the question of maladministration or misappropriation or mismanagement of funds in a temple that makes less than 10,000 a year? Therefore, this takes me to a very different concept altogether. But let's just go back to again 1920s and 30s. We are still talking of a period when you did not have the Constitution of 1950. Therefore, secularism as a concept and the separation of the temple and the state and the church and the state was still not codified, so to speak, and therefore you did not have a constitution under whose framework you can examine these activities. So this legislation again gets amended, and you bring in the, so the 1927 legislation continues. In the year 1950, something happens which triggers a monumental shift in the history of these legislations. Shirur Mutt in Udupi, the Chidambaram temple in the then South Arcot district, the Guruvayur temple, and another temple in Karnataka, all these temples are notified under the dreaded chapter 6A for takeover by the respective governments. So each of these temples, they approach the Madras High Court and the respective high courts, challenging the government order which notifies the takeover of the temples by the government. Apart from challenging the government order, they also challenge, so we are talking of 1950 now. So since it's 1950, the constitution has already come into existence. Therefore, they also challenge the constitutionality of multiple provisions of the 1927 legislation, along with the challenge to the government order before the Madras High Court. During the course of the litigation, the old Act of 1927 is repealed and the new legislation of 1951 comes into force. So they amend, the petitioners amend their existing petitions, and they now challenge the 1951 legislation along with the government order which notified those temples. The Madras High Court practically agrees with every contention of all the petitioners, strikes down all the salient provisions of the 1951 temple legislation as being unconstitutional for taking away the rights of the community to administer its own temples under Article 26, and goes on to say that the right of religious denominations to administer their own religious institutions has been eviscerated and emasculated by the legislation of 1951. So the state appeals against this, and this goes to the Supreme Court. So this forms the backdrop of the landmark decision of 1954 known as the Shirur Mutt case, where the Supreme Court goes on to strike down and most of these provisions. More or less it agrees with what the Madras High Court has said, but it also disagrees with some of the aspects that the Madras High Court had held as unconstitutional. But by and large, the salient unconstitutionality and the manifest illegality of these provisions and the legislation was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1954. One would have hoped that a decision from the highest court of the land, the highest constitutional court of the land, would have been a strong enough message for the state to mend its ways and limit the scope of its interference with Hindu religious institutions. But they come out with a new legislation in 1959, which is the legislation in force even today, which paraphrases the very same provisions which were struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So, lo and behold, that here the state itself could be hauled up for contempt for having passed a legislation containing similar provisions or near identical provisions which were struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional in 1954. One would have hoped that the moment the legislation came out in 1959, somebody would have challenged it and it would have been again held as unconstitutional. But then Hindu apathy plays a huge role in this, because these legislations were challenged for the very first time by the late Sri Swami Dayanand Saraswati in 2012.